Okay, guys, we are starting the Vietnam War today. This is the start of the Vietnam War lecture. And we are going to be camped out in the Vietnam War for a couple of weeks. So we are going to start it today. You're going to do a little bit more work on it when we get back from spring break. We'll talk about the home front, a little bit more of the fighting, and then how this thing kind of winds down. But we're going to introduce it today. And to understand why the Vietnam War starts, we actually have to go back, like usual, this time to the 1800s, because Vietnam and the surrounding areas, so Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, these three modern day countries, back in the 1800s, they were all basically one region. You didn't have these carved out three countries. They were just one region, and we called them Indochina. In this region, in Southeast Asia, Indochina, it was owned by France. So France took control of it in the 1800s, and they had it for a really, really, really long time, okay? Until World War II. We talked about last time when we learned about the Kennedy presidency that after World War II, you have an effort to decolonize the world, which basically means that the Europeans let go of all of their overseas colonies that they had accumulated during the age of imperialism. So Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, India would be included in there, Latin America. The Europeans, sometimes willingly, sometimes they're forced to by revolutionary movements, they're letting go of all of their colonies. And this is when we get the beginning, the development of the third world, which we talked about last time, okay? So this is kind of building on that, kind of overlapping with that period of time. One of these new countries is Vietnam. In the 1950s, you have a revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, super important name. Make sure that you write that down or circle it on your note sheet if you're taking notes on it. Ho Chi Minh, he basically says, I'm going to overthrow France. And so he leads a revolutionary movement in Vietnam to try to overthrow their French oppressors. Now, the thing about this is that Ho Chi Minh is a communist, okay? And so this makes America nervous. Now, normally we would side on the revolutionary movement, right? We're always like friends with the underdog. We ally with the underdog, except for this time, right? Because we know that if Ho Chi Minh is successful, then Vietnam and Indochina, this whole region, they're going to become communist, right? And because of the Truman Doctrine, we cannot let that happen, right? So this is in the 1950s. This is when President Truman is still in office, and we know what Truman's policy was. I'm just going to send lots and lots and lots of money to this region, basically to help them fight the spread of communism. We saw him do this in Germany. We saw him do this in the Marshall Plan. We saw him do this with the Berlin airlift. When else did we see him do it? Greece and Turkey. We've seen him do it a bunch of times. So he does it here too, just sends them lots of money, hopefully hoping that that's going to kind of starve off Ho Chi Minh and his forces. So we're basically helping France fight against Ho Chi Minh, sending them billions of dollars between like 1950 and 1954, okay? Now, eventually Truman leaves office and we get a new president, President Eisenhower. So he kind of inherits the situation in 1953, and he continues what Truman did. He keeps giving lots of money to France to help them fight communism and Ho Chi Minh, okay? Eisenhower believed in something called the Domino Theory, okay? This is why he keeps giving money to France and trying to help them fight Ho Chi Minh. The Domino Theory essentially is that if Vietnam falls, the rest of the countries in that region are also going to fall, just like dominoes, right? So we're not just talking about one country, we're talking about the entire region, okay? Think of dominoes, right? When you set them all up, if you tip one, the goal of dominoes is basically the whole line falls. And so that's what Eisenhower is afraid of, right? If we let go of Vietnam, it might just be one country, but if they turn communist, it's likely that the rest of the region, the rest of Indochina, is also going to turn communist. So that's why he's so invested in this country, okay, in Vietnam. And so he just keeps sending money and money and money to France. Now, eventually, Ho Chi Minh becomes really successful, right? I mean, the Vietnamese, they want their freedom. And so a lot of people fight with Ho Chi Minh. And when we get to 1954, Ho Chi Minh's army has basically taken control of all of France's major military garrisons. And so there's this like 55-day siege. Ho Chi Minh kills like 15,000 Frenchmen. It's a disaster for France, okay? This is when the United States knows like this is taking a disastrous turn. Like the money isn't enough anymore. So the United States kind of calls a timeout and says, we're going to meet together in Geneva. We're going to hold something called the Geneva Accords. Another thing to circle, underline, something that I want you to remember. We call the Geneva Accords, and this is basically when the United States, France, and the Vietnamese, we're all just going to sit around a table and we're going to talk about how we can work this out, okay? And what we work out is basically allowing France to declare that Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, all of Indochina, they are independent, okay? Now, you should be scratching your heads a little bit because isn't this what we didn't want, right? We don't want Ho Chi Minh to turn the whole area, the whole region communist, the Domino Theory, right? And so the United States kind of has a plan. Now, we know how the United States has dealt with these newly freed countries up until this time. We just split them in half and share, right? We did this with Korea, where the North Korea was communist, South Korea was democratic. We did this in Berlin, East and West. We did this with Germany as a whole, East and West. We just keep splitting these countries. This is another example of that. Yes, Vietnam gets their freedom, but Ho Chi Minh is only in control of the top half of North Vietnam. So North Vietnam is communist, and South Vietnam, the United States is going to take ownership of that. So it's going to be a capitalist democracy, okay? So in the Geneva Accords in 1954, we split Vietnam in half. You have the North, which is communist, and the South, which is a capitalist democracy. Now we say we're not going to keep it this way for long. We say, don't worry, in 1956, in 2 years, we're going to have Vietnam vote, and they're going to vote for a new leader, and they're going to vote to become unified under one system. So we're going to let them in 2 years decide if they want to be capitalist or if they want to be communist, okay? Now, we should know by now that this is not a promise that the United States intends to keep. In 1954, the U.S., about a year later, we form a treaty, an organization treaty, which basically says that our goal is to prevent the spread of communism in this whole area. We see this threat kind of arising, and we want to stop this threat from forming. So the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization is basically an alliance in that area, Indochina, Southeast Asia, in order to try to prevent the spread of communism. And once we make this alliance and kind of set this goal, it opens up an opportunity for the United States to start sending even more money and military aid to South Vietnam. They have a new leader, his name is Diem, and we start sending him lots of money. We even send some troops over there to protect him. The problem is this guy he's bad news. He's super corrupt. The people of South Vietnam, his own people, they absolutely hate him. And so a lot of them don't trust the United States because the United States is protecting him. Now, they don't like him so much. The South Vietnamese, they can't stand their leader Diem so much that a couple years later in 1957, you actually have a group called the National Liberation Front, the NLF, that forms in South Vietnam. And their goal is just to get rid of Diem. They want to get rid of Diem and they want to reunite Vietnam, North and South, and be under communist control under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, okay? So they basically, these guerrilla fighters, the NLF, they lead this surprise attack in South Vietnam because they're trying to, again, reunite the country with the North and become communist. Now, this is a problem because all of a sudden you have all of these surprise attacks happening in the South. The United States has to do something about it, or else the whole country is going to tip and become communist, right? This is an open threat. And so President Kennedy, the president at the time, he decides, I'm going to send more troops over to South Vietnam to try to get rid of the NLF and stop all of these surprise attacks. Now, this is important. This is an important turning point because we are not technically in a war yet, right? We're just trying to protect South Vietnam from becoming communist. But by doing that, we send, by 1963, 15,000 American soldiers over to Vietnam. So again, even though we're not in a war yet, we have thousands of soldiers over there just kind of, waiting for something to happen. It's not going to take much for a war to start because we already have so many soldiers stationed over there. So how does the war actually start? Okay, In the 1960s, we just said we're sending over all of these troops. How are these troops getting there? Well, they're going on boats. So we're sending over naval ships, warships, unloading all of our thousands of soldiers off the coast of Vietnam. Okay, so we send over in 1964, August of 1964, a big boat called the Uss Maddox. Another named or term to kind of circle on your notes or write it down. The USS Maddox. Okay, and it's sitting in Vietnam off the coast in an area called the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, so this boat's just kind of sitting there. It's minding its business. We just reloaded all of these. Loaded off all of these soldiers, and all of a sudden it gets torpedoed, okay? And of course, we suspect it to be the North Vietnamese, and so it hits the papers. The United States has been attacked. In the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox has been torpedoed by the North Vietnamese. We end up shooting back. Even though the Maddox, it wasn't actually hit. It was targeted, but it wasn't actually hit. We fire back at a bunch of North Vietnamese ships. So we basically take out our retaliation. Now, Kennedy has died at this point, okay? And so the president that you guys researched yesterday, LBJ, Lyndon B Johnson, he is now in power. He is now president. So President Johnson, he looks at this situation in the Gulf of Tonkin, right? In his mind, the United States has been attacked by the North Vietnamese. So he goes to Congress and he basically says, we need to retaliate for the strike against the USS Maddox. Now, Congress passes something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So important, has so many implications for basically every war that we've gotten into since Vietnam, even Iraq and Afghanistan. All of our most recent wars are affected by this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, okay? Now, let me tell you why. Typically, when we're about to get into a war, the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war, right? It's a congressional responsibility to declare war, meaning that only Congress can do that, not the president. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is important because it gives the president war-making ability. Basically, what Congress says in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is, you know what, President Johnson, LBJ, you can take any necessary measures, any means to protect the United States from further aggression by Ho Chi Minh and the North. Okay, so basically it gives LBJ a blank check to do whatever he wants to keep America safe from Ho Chi Minh. Now, this is not the same thing as a declaration of war, but Johnson interprets it that way. And it basically gives the president war powers. He can do whatever he wants without a declaration of war formally coming from Congress. So he basically kind of circumvents, he goes around the Constitution in order to basically start a war with Vietnam. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the attack on the Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, this is our short-term direct cause of the Vietnam War. If I ask you, what is the short-term cause? How did the Vietnam War start? Your answer is the Gulf of Tonkin and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that's passed by Congress. Okay, so now we're in this war. It's 1965. Okay, and so we get over there. We already have 15,000 troops stationed, and we just start sending more and more troops. By 1964 to 1973, within that about 10-year period of time, we send over about 2 million troops to Vietnam. Huge numbers of infantry over in Vietnam. Now, how do we have all of these troops that we can send over? Again, back to President Kennedy. Remember his flexible response? He wanted to be ready for everything and how he emphasized building up the military. We now have so many members of the armed forces, it's like an unlimited flow, but we're going to see that even that has its limits, and the draft is eventually invoked as well. So we send over about 2 million troops to Vietnam. Now, when we get over there in mass, we realize, the South Vietnamese, they are not able to defend themselves. And so our strategy, our wartime strategy in Vietnam becomes something called Americanization, or Americanize the war effort. We basically are going to be in the driver's seat, even though the South Vietnamese are going to help us fight the North and Ho Chi Minh. It's really going to be the Americans who are leading the charge in fighting, because we know that without our people, our resources, our weapons, it's just never going to happen. Okay, so how do we actually go about fighting the war? At least early on, we do it in 3 different means. Okay, the first way that we fight the war, and the most predominant way, is basically in airstrikes. There are tons and tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam. And we've kind of alluded to this back when we talked about World War II and all the bombs that were dropped, even like in Berlin. Remember when I said this is gonna be like, playing in the sandbox, like child's play, when we compare this to what happens in Vietnam? This is what I was talking about. Between 1965 and 1973, so again, about this 10-year period over in Vietnam, listen to this number. We dropped more than 6 million tons of bombs on North Vietnamese camps and bases. Now, okay, think about that, 6 million tons. This is not on one country. I mean, Vietnam is relatively small, right? That's on half of a country. So take the country of Vietnam, which is tiny, and then cut it in half. We dropped 6 million tons of bombs on that half, okay? Now, to put this in perspective, this number, that 6 million tons, this is 3 times the amount of bombs that was dropped than all of World War II by all of the countries involved. So think of Hitler, think of Stalin, think of Churchill, think of America, think of Mussolini, think of all of the different people that were dropping bombs in World War II. Take that number, times it by 3, and that's how many bombs the United States dropped on this half of a tiny country. A lot. If you kind of click over in your PowerPoint slides, you'll see a picture of what the jungles look like in Vietnam all the time. I mean, there's just bombs going off everywhere. Okay, so that's definitely our preferred strategy, is airstrikes through bombs. But what makes these bombs even more deadly is that we're not just dropping bombs, but these bombs are charged with chemical weapons. And we have 2 chemical weapons that we use a lot during the Vietnam War. The first one is called napalm, okay? And when you look over at that one picture of kind of the fire in that jungle in the PowerPoint slide, what causes that fire effect is this chemical weapon, napalm, right? Vietnam and the surrounding areas, basically that whole Southeast Asian region, is covered in thick jungle. So it's really hard to fight in it because there's a lot of coverage for your enemy. You just don't know where they are, and they're going to use that to their advantage. So the Americans quickly know, we have to clear out these jungles as best as we possibly can. And so the way that we do that is basically by setting them on fire, by using napalm. So we're dropping bombs, but we're dropping this chemical as well, and it's just covering the entire jungle in fire. Okay, now you have to think this is a third world country. This isn't like an urban country where the people are living in cities. People are living in these jungles. And so the civilian impact is massive when we're looking at the death tolls from soldiers and civilians because of napalm. The other chemical weapon that we use is something called Agent Orange. And again, this was intended to kill all of the jungles, all the trees and plants that are in this area that we're fighting in. It's a herbicide. And so all of those thick forests, again, the idea is that we're covering them in Agent Orange, and they're going to die, and then we can clear them away, and then we can go in and fight much more clearly and kind of see what we're doing. We call it Agent Orange because you can see pictures of it. It's basically this orange gas that was let out from behind planes. So a U.S. plane would fly over a jungle, you'd see this orange gas coming out, and it would just fall on the trees and kill anything. Now, again, there are people who are living in these jungles. So you have all kinds of cancers and diseases from people who were exposed to Agent Orange for long periods of time. So again, not only just a military effect, but there's also a large civilian effect on this as well. And then the third strategy that the U.S. uses to fight Vietnam, again, is just ground troops. Like I said before, you have about 2 million soldiers that are stationed in Vietnam over this 10-year period. So we're just talking about American troops all the time are getting sent over to Vietnam by the thousands and thousands, and that's going to have a real effect later on American morale. But in terms of, again, how we're fighting this war, we're Americanizing it by dropping a lot of bombs, using chemical weapons, and by sending over millions and millions of troops. Now, lastly, how are the Vietnamese fighting this war? How is Ho Chi Minh tackling the United States? Because he knows we're a tiny country. I mean, we're not even a country. We're a half of a country, and we're going against one of the world's superpowers, the United States, right, who has unlimited resources. So he knows this is an uphill battle. He's the underdog, right? So he knows his best chance is basically to wear down the Americans. He knows he's not going to launch this like amazing attack that's going to kick us out of the war. It's just never going to happen. But if he can launch lots of little attacks over and over and over and over and just never give up, then eventually he believes that it's going to wear down the Americans, and eventually they're just going to give up and not care anymore. Okay, and he's kind of right. We're going to see that his strategy is really effective. He uses guerrilla warfare tactics, which we've talked a lot about guerrilla warfare. Again, it uses that element of surprise. Your enemy kind of jumps out at you. It's not traditional ways of fighting. Again, his goal is to keep Americans off guard, so you never know where they're coming from. The way that he does that, again, is by utilizing the jungles. This is why Americans were so obsessed with clearing out the jungles, because you would be an American troop, right? And you can see him on your PowerPoint. There's a picture, and you're walking through the jungle, and all of a sudden you hear gunfire. You see it, and it's coming from what seems like all around you. Usually you would have Viet Cong not on the ground, but up in the trees fighting down at you. And so you have them in the trees, you have them in the brush around you, they've dug into caves and behind rocks, and so they're just surrounding you and using the foliage, the jungles, and that element of surprise to again catch American troops off guard. They would also dig tunnels, and they would hide all day in these tunnels. They love to attack Americans at night, right? So most of the fighting took place at night. So you're an American troop, you're walking through the jungles all day long. You finally get your place to make camp, you lay down, you cannot sleep. The stress level and the paranoia is so high, because this is when the Viet Cong usually comes out of their tunnels, out of their hiding places in the jungle, and this is when they largely attack, right? And so American troops have this sense of paranoia. They're always kind of stressed out and never really know how or where their next fight is going to be. You also have the Viet Cong making use of landmines. They set up booby traps in the jungles. But probably the most heinous way that they fight this war and kind of keep Americans off guard is by using civilians. This is something we've seen before. In Japan, we talked about how the Japanese were planning that if the U.S. did invade Tokyo, they were going to arm their civilians, right? Everybody was going to be transformed into a soldier. And so the Vietnamese, they use this strategy too, because again, Ho Chi Minh and the North, they know if we're going to win this thing, it's all hands on deck against the Americans. And so you would have these American troops who would go into these villages, right? There's these villages all scattered throughout the jungles. You would be passing through a village, and these little kids would run up to the Americans with candy and gifts, so happy to see them, but they'd get a little closer to these kids and they'd realize that there were bombs strapped to their chest, right? And so you'd have so many American deaths just by passing through these villages and not knowing if they were enemy or friendly Vietnamese civilians. And so again, adding to the paranoia and to the stress of fighting this war, it's a very difficult war to fight for a long period of time, because you have to manage all of those different elements. You don't know where the fighting is coming from, and you don't know who is your enemy. Is it this kid? Is it the actual soldier who is sitting up in a tree? I mean, who is my enemy? The things that the Americans end up having to do in order to fight against these civilians are just, they cause mass levels of PTSD among the soldiers, the veterans that return home. So again, this is just kind of an introductory lecture setting up how this thing starts, why we get involved in Vietnam, and kind of what our strategy is at the get-go. But after spring break, when we come back, we're going to talk more about how our strategy develops and changes as the war changes, and how Americans kind of lose interest in the war and become really angry. There's a really big anti-war movement that starts in the late 60s and early 70s, and kind of why that gets going as we come back after break. So this is your last lecture before spring break. I hope you guys enjoy it. You've worked really hard the last couple of weeks. I had scheduled some homework. I'm just canceling it. You don't want to do it. I don't want to grade it. So just enjoy your spring break and get refreshed, stay healthy, keep washing your hands. And I will see you via YouTube when we get back from spring break. Okay. If you need anything in that time, feel free to reach out. And I'm here for you. Okay. Miss you guys.